Adventures of Captain Marvel, in a way, is the first major comic book film being released in 1941 across 12 chapters, and adapting the very popular comic book superhero of the day, Captain Marvel, or Shazam, since this guy and this guy came and took his name. The full production was shot in December 1940 to January 1941, taking about 3 weeks to shoot. Republic Pictures, the company that made the film, really wanted to make a serial about Superman, but couldn't get the rights to the character, so they opted to hit up the rival company Fawcett, the company that created Captain Marvel, to see if they could use their character, since DC wouldn't buy Fawcett's catalog until way down the line. Hell, in this era, Fawcett and DC were distantly the most popular comic book companies, given the success of Superman and Captain Marvel. Anyhow, the script for the Superman project that they were developing was completed, but since it was vetoed, that film would be retooled into The Mysterious Dr. Satan, which would be a Superman knockoff film following the exploits of Bob Wayne, the Copperhead, and his girlfriend Lois Scott. I swear, plagiarism laws back in the day were damn loose. Imagine pitching a script and having it rejected, then just making it anyways by simply changing the love interest's last name and then taking a different asset from the company and slightly retooling it as the main character's new name. I mean, Bob Wayne, Bruce Wayne, not exactly subtle. DC Comics, then National Publications, actually tried to get The Adventures of Captain Marvel to not be produced, suing over the vague idea that Republic was denied a Superman film, thus they shouldn't be able to use the competition, though that never went anywhere, and a more blanket Captain Marvel vs. Superman lawsuit wouldn't come till a bit down the line. Frank Cooligan was cast as Billy Batson and Tom Tyler as Captain Marvel, though Tom Tyler was a bit lanky for the role and apparently was pretty bad at setups, accidentally beating on actors for real during fight scenes or knocking over and ruining the flimsy props on set. The Lydecker brothers, who did much of Republic's effects and serials back in the day, had to find a way to make Captain Marvel fly, and did so by flinging around a 7-foot dummy on strings. David Sharp, a Golden Age stunt performer, would start the effect by just launching himself directly into the air, and then try to pull out so not to snap his back like a twig. Safety standards were not much of a thing back in the day. The costumes for Captain Marvel looked well enough, though the logo is, not great, but apparently people really fucked with this costume since the Adventures of Superman TV show somehow acquired one of the suits, and a Kryptonian council member in the first episode of the show can be seen wearing it, as well as in the sci-fi show Space Patrol, which also used the costume. The plot is fairly standard for a serial and is a whodunit mystery. Basically, Billy Batson is on an archaeological voyage to a volcanic area guarded by natives with a group of people when they find a scorpion relic with a series of lenses that can be put on it to make the so-called Golden Scorpion, a deadly super weapon that can also make gold out of random metals. Billy ends up bored by the whole thing and ends up wandering off, but the wizard Shazam pulls up and gives him the powers of Captain Marvel. Shazam! Upon their return to America, a man called Scorpion is trying to steal the Golden Scorpion and its lenses, plotting to take the pieces from each of the men on the voyage, since each man was tasked with safeguarding one of the lenses, like goddamn Thanos with the Infinity Stones. Though with that, the Scorpion himself was revealed to be one of the group's men. Of course, Captain Marvel does some shazamming to foil his plots one by one to get these lenses, but eventually they head back to the volcanic area and they find out the offending scientist was Luther Bentley, but the natives kill him.
I'm going to show you how you've been misled by an imposter. Bentley!
Anyways, Captain Marvel then tosses the contraption into the volcano like the Ring of Power in The Lord of the Rings, and the surviving scientists head home and I guess they live happily ever after or whatever. We never see him again. This movie was not uncommon with serials comprising an almost entirely new cast with very few adaptations beyond the main character. Billy Batson or Captain Marvel, who these days goes by Shazam since the name was taken by a few other heroes after his name was no longer copyrighted following the collapse of Fawcett Comics, first appeared in Wiz Comics #2 from 1940 and was a pretty direct response to Superman. Basically, the idea, as created by Bill Parker and C.C. Beck, was what if Superman was a kid instead of Clark Kent, or rather, what if a kid could transform into Superman? A concept that kind of came about as the sidekick boom was happening, and heroes like Robin were being introduced, and it seemed kid characters attracted kid readers, which was largely the target demographic of comic books in those days, along with American GIs in search of escapism. For this video, I'll reflect primarily on how the character compared to the era and not really consider the modern interpretations, and as far as it goes, I think they did pretty well. I do think the child aspect is a little more downplayed for this film, seeing as they really just wanted to do a Superman film, and that kind of pulled over to the actual serial. But the general idea is kind of there. Kid ends up on an adventure somehow, and turns into ostensibly Superman to help him find his way out of trouble when it arises. Honestly reminds me a bit of a mix of Tintin, a popular French comic, and Superman, and I think that was translated well enough here. Whitey Murphy was a friend of Billy's in the film and was one of the rare occurrences a character was pulled from the films into the comics, with the film premiering in March 1941 and Whitey's first appearance being Wiz Comics 22, happening in October of that year. Can we just talk about how crazy it was that this film was shooting less than a year after Captain Marvel's brand was created? Like, damn, they picked it up fast. Finally, you have Luther Bentley or the Scorpion, who's a masked villain planning to harness the Infinity Stones, the lenses of the Golden Scorpion to, I guess, make a super weapon since it has a super laser capabilities, I guess. There are many villains named the Scorpion over the years. Spider-Man's Mac Gargan, for example, at Marvel, but DC has a fair amount, including a Western character, a Blackhawks villain, a Hunchback villain, and more. But never another Captain Marvel villain named the Scorpion, though he briefly appeared in a children's book back in the 1940s, The Scorpion Returns, part of a series of dime action books made for kids, which I guess you could consider kind of novellas, I don't know. I have one from the Fantastic Four and one from Batman that came out years and years ago. They are more or less like old school junior novels, mostly text but with a few pictures in there too. Captain Marvel or Billy Batson in this film is a superhero who just kind of stumbles into the superhero powers and immediately accepts the fact. Being that this is a 12-part adventure serial, the narrative doesn't really stop to give him much urgency. The setup of the plot is like a 5-minute intro, then a 6-minute set piece, followed by a cliffhanger, which makes determining a character arc pretty hard. He gets his powers after a brief introduction into the plot, and then from there, he's just Captain Marvel. No need to train or ponder. This is just his life now, I guess. Betty is the female damsel that occasionally gets in trouble via being captured or in a perilous death trap. You get the idea. Whitey is the friend, and all the other scientists are more or less just on the suspect lists, with Luther Bentley ultimately being the Scorpion, who's a criminal mastermind looking for the Golden Scorpion as a means to, shoot lasers. The Scorpion is worshipped by the native population, but they murder him when it turns out he's just some crusty old white dude. The tone of this is very much a whodunit, a modern example being like a Knives Out or something. Everyone's a suspect, and it's up to Billy to find out who it is as a hook to keep people coming back for each part of the show. The action is of course dated since the movie was shot 85 years ago, but it's still fun and the suspense is there and built into the narrative very well. It has some darker moments, I guess, with some death and turmoil, but ultimately the idea of the narrative is just to have fun watching Captain Marvel kick some ass for a few hours. Cy Feuer did the music on this film and was a musician who primarily worked in the theater. Like the plays, not the movies. He won a Tony Lifetime Achievement Award and did a vast amount of projects, some not even cataloged. He's probably most famous for having produced the film Cabaret, which was nominated for Best Picture. The music's pretty good. It's a very standard adventure serial type of feel, with lots of exciting moments, good setups, and atmosphere for the world. We don't actually have a credited editor on the project, but William Whitey and John English co-directed the project. William Whitey started working on serials before pretty naturally moving over to TV, following TV replacing the serial. He did lots of Dick Tracy, Lone Ranger, and Zorro serials, working in films of this vein quite a bit. John English worked on a lot of westerns and was also a semi-notable editor. The film is edited pretty well with quick action, breakneck exposition. It's certainly not boring despite it being pretty old-fashioned by today's standards. The cliffhangers are usually strong, though some are kind of laughable, like when Captain Marvel's put in a death trap and the serial's like, "You think Captain Marvel's gonna die?" And then he just walks it off since he's fucking invincible, which we all knew anyways. William Nobles did the cinematography, and it's a fairly static, set-heavy black and white film. Back in the day, cameras and film were so cumbersome, there was only so much you could do with the technology, but given the time period, it looks pretty okay. It's not shot like shit, which is pretty much what one could say positively about a film of this time. In terms of stuff that aged poorly, the native stuff is moderately racist here and there. The Turban Man in Billy's Party was the red herring character, and I think the audience was also supposed to think the guy was sneaky as hell. Like, what was he hiding under that turban?
The sign of the scorpion.
Where did you get it? At Carlyle's. I was going through his study in the hope of finding a clue.
Also, there was a Japanese man in episode 4, and that rarely ends well in this era. Of course, he was a traitor and followed some tropes of the era, but at least it wasn't yellowface, and they casted an actual Japanese American, which is a plus, I suppose. As far as it goes, this film could have been much, much more racist. We are gonna get to the Batman 1943 film pretty soon here. Now, I know it's hard to give brownie points to a film for only being slightly racist, but hey, definitely could be worse. Some other noteworthy things: the guy who played the wizard, Nigel D. Bruler, was pretty good. He looks like an old wizard. I do think that Billy's meeting was a little awkward, like why are they standing 2 feet apart?
Captain Marvel, and take on the virtues you see recorded there.
I also think it's cool seeing the world of the 1940s and kind of seeing the golden age of comics brought to life, which is an interesting mix of simple stories but also shockingly cutting of the times. I love the old serial trope for fight scenes, which was just people in a room smashing dummy furniture over each other's heads, and there's plenty of that here. It's a charming trope, even if it's a bit cheap looking by today's standards. It's not like modern superhero films. Shazam isn't throwing a car, but he'll sure as hell throw some poorly assembled chairs at someone. The costumes, as I said, are pretty meh. The Captain Marvel logo on the suit looks stupid. It seemed pretty whipped together. You know, they could have just cut it out better and sewed it on. Not sure why it's this little logo. Also, the Scorpion has an awful suit. Look, I'm not expecting much, but why did they embroider scorpions over his nipples? That seemed a little bit odd. It looks like he's getting groped. I also don't get why they didn't just destroy the Scorpion from the start, or at least when the Scorpion started killing people. For whatever reason, they divided out the pieces. The Golden Scorpion MacGuffin could make gold or be used as a super weapon, but Billy and all the researchers didn't really seem interested in that. Perhaps, give it to the government or put it back. I'm not sure, but I don't think the best solution was to divide out the pieces and then have this mystery go on. But despite the convolution, that is kind of what the serial needed to have a plot, so whatever, I guess. The setup is definitely very convoluted, but meh. Overall, it's solid enough for what it is. It is dated for sure, but it's basically just a detective film with some Captain Marvel hijinks. The fight scenes, set pieces, and cliffhangers keep the dopamine rolling, plus it feels like a historical film, in part because it was breaking ground in the field of comic book superhero films, but also because it's actually pretty much a golden age comic book put to screen. Back in the day, comics rarely featured large epic stories. It was just a hero fighting gangsters or criminals, whatever. Occasionally, a costume villain would show up, and when they did, they were pretty much just gangsters that dressed weird. It's entertaining, not totally repulsive by today's standards, and the mystery is alright. Is it a masterpiece? No. But for a film serial, I think it's one that's worth checking out if you're curious on the origin of the superhero film genre.